So I was on a cookie run to Target the other day, and of course, I went down the toy aisle. Going down the aisle, I spied these micro Galaxy Star Wars vehicles by Jazzwares, and I'm not gonna lie, they got me feeling pretty nostalgic. They remind me a lot of the Micro Machines action fleet vehicles that come from back in the 90s. And that little burst of nostalgia, it set me down the rabbit hole, and I was thinking about how different things were as a nerd and a collector back in the 90s than they are now. You young nerds have no idea what it was like for us. Pre-ordering wasn't a thing, we couldn't just stream everything we wanted, video games looked like crap. It was very different. Let's take a trip down memory lane and look at how different things are for 90s nerds versus current nerds. What's up, everybody? My name is Matt, also called Big Nerdy. Together we are the NWO, the Nerd World Order, and you're watching Nerdzoic. It was very different in the 90s. In the 90s, it wasn't cool to be a nerd. I feel like now it's almost like the cool thing to do. Like, hey look, I'm nerdy, I watch Marvel. Back then, it was not cool. People got bullied for it. Like, you didn't normally see the high school quarterback who also happened to have a huge comic collection. It just didn't go. Everyone had their defined roles. You had nerds, you had the goths, you had the vamps, you had the jocks, you had the bookie kids, which had a name that I can't remember. Oh, the preppies. And there wasn't that much mixing together. And really, nerds were like, that was like the lowest tier of society. In fact, being a nerd back then, it really was about escapism at the time for like the outcasts of society. It was nice to be able to come together with similar people and do things like play Magic the Gathering or watch Japanese wrestling tapes and hit each other with stop signs. Wait, that was just my friend group. It was just a completely different time. The atmosphere that we see on Stranger Things is very similar to how it was. I mean, that's the 80s, but that is the way nerds were still treated in the 90s. They were bullied. Now, there's still some exceptions to this. Mike Tyson was a giant X-Men fan and comic collector, and ain't nobody bullying him. And frankly, nobody bullied me. I mean, I'm called Big Nerdy, there's a reason for it. In fact, there's a whole story there about getting expelled, and yeah, that's another day. And the nerdiness is just everywhere now. Blockbuster movies are gone. Like, no more do we get like the big action blockbuster, except for like the occasional new series that come out like John Wick and Olympus Has Fallen or Risen, whatever the hell it's doing this week. And the Marvel movies sell tickets better than anything else. Superhero movies have become like the norm. Like, they are the big movie and there's nothing else, which kind of sucks in a way. I can't imagine a show like Game of Thrones being popular back then, because back then it would only have appealed to a very niche audience, and I don't think that like the common casual viewers would have enjoyed it. Nowadays you see everybody being open with their nerdiness, some people even just doing it to get some nerd cred, which is interesting. You got celebrities like Post Malone playing Magic the Gathering, you got Vin Diesel who's into Dungeons and Dragons, Leo DiCaprio collects Star Wars figures, Big Nerdy makes videos on YouTube, but yeah, nobody cares about that part, but yeah, very, very different. Speaking of toys, let's talk about collecting. The truth is, collecting was way easier back then. For one thing, the cost of toys was so much cheaper. You could go and get 3 3/4 inch figures for $5, like no big deal. Vehicles were $25, $30, $40 if they really wanted to push it. And it wasn't just toys, collecting really hit its fever pitch in the 90s. There were things like sports cards, which crashed in the early 90s, Hogs, collectible card games really started to make their way then, and then comics, which again also kind of crashed. It was a very different time of collecting. Like I said, TCGs like Magic, boom. Pokemon, boom, still boom. Yu-Gi-Oh, I don't know nothing about that one, but it's still around. But it was only a few dollars a pack. I mean, it's still only a few dollars a pack. Then there were people who were trying to get into the collecting market, like, all right, we gotta be the next Pogs. So we get Beanie Babies, which you can't even sell at yard sales now. Comics were so abundant at the time that you can still find warehouses full of them today. One time I had a boss who found out like I was into this nerdy stuff and value, and he told me that he had a long box of Superman Death issues still in their original plastic, and he really thought that he was gonna retire on that. Yeah, I made him really sad. Fast forward to now, comics seem to have evened out. Grading has really changed things. There is not nearly as many comic shops, and honestly, floppy comics like regular issues, they're probably gonna die eventually. Digital comics have really made the way forward for comics, and they are the future, even though trade paperbacks are sold everywhere now, including major bookstores. I thought the toy collector crowd was nuts. You go see those Pokemon collectors, those guys, they throw fists. Talking about toys, we can talk about one thing that's a big positive. The quality of action figure has become insanely better. In the 90s, they were just toys. They weren't collectible quality. They weren't made with the collector in mind. There wasn't a focus on articulation and photoreal technology. It wasn't until Marvel Legends in 2002 with Toy Biz where that really started to take off. I mean, technically it was Spider-Man Legends, but you get my point. Back then, most toys were just 5 points of articulation, sometimes even 2 or 3. You can find customizing guides out there for how to put knees on figures so that you can make Han Solo fit in the cockpit without his legs going straight. Some of them were just not realistic. Look at Luke Skywalker, look how jacked he is, he looks like Arnold. And the Marvel figures from this time weren't that much better, but they were better. Like, look at the size of this Juggernaut figure compared to this Beast figure. That doesn't hold a true representation of what you see in the comics. Nowadays, toys got 20, 30 points of articulation, we expect a photoreal face scan, we expect a good paint job with varying degrees of layers. We have much higher expectations than we used to. Many import figures give us a ton of accessories and swappable heads and different eyes and hands, and could you imagine if you were going to go back in time then and be like, oh yeah, in the future, you can get figures and they got extra heads and extra hands. Oh yeah, this is garbage. It's just crazy. A lot of those imports are Marvel figures, and it's hard to believe this, but Marvel almost died back in the 90s. Like, Marvel was the Titanic. Now, I don't have all of my ducks in a row with research, so please don't quote me exactly. I'm giving you a rough history lesson here. But basically, Toy Biz and Marvel were joined at the hips, and there was some bankruptcy stuff. Marvel almost went out of business. It was crazy, because Marvel was just a mess. They were still putting out some good work, but it was just a mess from a business standpoint. One of the reasons it managed to stay around was selling off its movie licenses. That's why we got the Fox X-Men or Spider-Man with Sony. Yeah, the first time Marvel made a movie, it wasn't until 2008 with Iron Man. And honestly, Iron Man was like a D-list, well, not D, but he was a B or a C-lister. He wasn't a big character. Speaking of superhero movies, back in the 90s, blockbusters weren't comic movies at all. Comic book movies were like a rarity. We had Batman 89, that was in 89 obviously, and we had, what was the second one? Batman Returns. I don't know how I couldn't remember that. They were both good, but then it got kiddie. We got Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, and it was terrible. And people just kind of looked at it as kiddie stuff. It really was. Now, thanks to like Christopher Nolan and the MCU, completely different world. Back then, not every movie was based on some franchise, and if I remember correctly, like the big ones were like James Bond, like, hey, we got a new Bond movie, but it was so different, it was crazy. That started to change when X-Men came out, and then it really started to change when Spider-Man came out, and the CGI was not great. I mean, I go back and I look at Lord of the Rings and Episode 1 now, and it's pretty bad. It's like a PlayStation 2 game. Ironically, some of the movies that were made before that, like Terminator 2, the special effects in that were fantastic, because a lot of it wasn't just computer, a lot of it was practical effects. Then you get some really bad stuff like Spawn. I think one thing everyone can agree on though, is that the cartoons in the 90s, they hit right, especially the superhero cartoons. X-Men cartoon, Batman animated series, we got a Superman cartoon, we got a Hulk cartoon, we got the Spider-Man cartoon. There's so many, and I'm blanking so I can't name them all. I did do a video on cartoons, so you probably should watch it. I'll put a link here. But yeah, it was pretty awesome. Watching this stuff was so different then too. You had to catch it live, unless you had like a VCR and a videotape to hit record. Scheduling it on the VCR, that was not easy. You had to be like a tech wizard to figure that crap out. Forget about on demand, and if you wanted to know what's coming up next, there's no internet to go to easily. You gotta get the TV Guide out. Get a TV Guide every week in the mail, or you could go watch a TV Guide channel, which at night, when I didn't want the TV off, my parents would turn that on for me when I was a kid, and just have the TV Guide channel playing like on loop all night. No wonder I'm crazy. And don't get me started on streaming. I wish we had streaming back then. I can't even imagine if you would have told me then that we'd be able to just turn on whatever you want now, and like you don't need to collect physical media. It was nuts. Speaking of nuts, there was like a drought of Star Wars then. All we had was the expanded universe, and let me tell you, I dove deep in that. The Thrawn trilogy, Dark Empire, Shadows of the Empire, just to name a few. It was an amazing time. I actually preferred this time. Granted, I missed the movies, but I really preferred the stories that came out then. Now, there were some stinkers in there, but overall, I liked them better. This even extended the comic books and video games, so even though we didn't have any movies until 99 when Phantom Menace came out, it was still a pretty good time for a dark time of Star Wars. Seriously, there were some amazing characters who were in that. Katarn, I never say it right, Mara Jade, the Solo Twins, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Dash Rendar, who was just a discount Han Solo. They were all pretty good characters. And some of them even made their way into like the Star Wars canon proper, even though I hate the fact that none of this is canon. They just pick and choose, but what are you gonna do? You can even see a lot of current characters with pieces of older characters who are not canon in there. Like Katarn, a lot of him in Cassian Andor. The whole Star Wars expanded universe really got me deeper into Star Wars. I just wanted to know more and more after I watched the movies. This led me into collecting toys, which after a 20-year craziness of toy collecting, I said, let's open a store. We actually built one in our basement. Want to see it? Check it out right here. And remember, you gotta get old, but you don't have to grow up. Just be cool and stay nerdy. Later.